So, my name is Brian Holt. This is now the third time I'm speaking, so some of you probably already heard me before. For the rest of you, I'm sorry. You're going to have to suffer through this again, or for the first time. But you can gather together and have empathy for each other about listening to me. This talk was originally called Promise Not to Use Promises, and it's kind of a trolly title, especially for people who like promises, so I decided to strike that one out and call it FRP, which just is totally meaningless, so I decided to strike that one out too. And so I decided to call it Functional Reactive Programming, and that's kind of shitty too, so I cut that one out too. And so I was kind of out of a loss, and I was like, well, how about like functional programming over time? Like, no, that's like totally meaningless, so fuck that too. And so I ended up kind of going round and round and round on this, and I ended up kind of just writing a talk and then coming back and naming it later. And what I ended up kind of writing was having empathy while teaching programming, because I was trying to teach functional programming and reactive programming, and ended up not working out super well. So I ended up kind of teaching something else totally, which is super weird, right? So if you're here to listen about FRP, this kind of like went in a different direction. And I'd say I'm sorry, but I actually really like this talk, and so sorry, not sorry. So let's talk about how I got here with giving this particular talk. Some of you may know these two beautiful bastards. These are the two organizers of the conference of Dev Day, and super awesome guys. I went out and had way too much beer and vodka with them, so I had a great time. They invited me to speak here at Dev Day, and it's been awesome. Krakow has been fantastic. This treated me and my wife really, really well. Yeah, super, super happy about it. And they ended up having a speaker back out. And so at the last moment, they kind of said, hey, do you have any additional talks that you could give to help us fill this time slot? And I said, yeah, no, I have this Observables talks that I gave last year, and I think it's still applicable. So they put that on the docket, and they said, okay, let's do this. And for some reason, they thought this was a good idea, and I don't know why they thought it was a good idea to ask me to give another talk, but I have an inclination of why they might have thought that. So this is different, right? This is different than what I originally intended. So if anyone is like, no, I wanted to hear about FRP, and I don't want to talk about this other things, like I have no problem if you just want to go. This talk is posted. I've given it before, so you can see it there at nho.lt/promise. The slides are posted. You can also check it out there. I'll tweet it later if that's interesting to you. And the talk's not very empathetic. It's actually pretty trolly, which is fun. It's really fun to troll people. It's actually one of my favorite things to do. I used to work at Reddit. That's what you do at Reddit, is you troll people. But it's mostly meant to entertain rather than inform. So, and just in case someone is really wants to talk about FRP or Rx or whatever you want to call it, I put out a couple slides right there at the end, and I'll run through it real quick anyway. Hopefully with a little bit less trolly attitude and maybe some better content. So let's talk about how I got to this place. And this is the only thing I'm going to say that's kind of sad. I think maybe not. No promises. 2 days ago, I had the opportunity to go to Auschwitz, which was a very sobering experience. If any of you have not done so, I highly encourage you to do it. It's transformative. And I just kind of got this thought that I ended up tweeting, which tweeting from Auschwitz sounds kind of like a bad idea. But I was pretty happy with it. That it's a sobering and raw experience in just how monstrous we as humans can be if we forsake our empathy. That really got me on the track of empathy, and I was thinking about teaching my workshop, which I taught yesterday, and that's kind of where I caught to this idea of like, I'm giving this really trolly talk that's really not helpful to a bunch of people, so maybe I have an opportunity to talk a little bit about something that I think have some unique abilities to talk about, which is teaching with empathy. So let's talk about what I'm not. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm a college dropout / college failure, depending on who you ask. I'm not a psychologist. I took AP psychology in high school, which makes me an expert. And I'm not a master of teaching of any sort. My day job is I work at Netflix, right? I'm a developer. I work on a website. But I can tell you what I am. I am a developer. Like, I do write code every day. I'm trying to be empathetic. That's, I guess, up to you if you think I am. And I have actually taught probably at this point maybe over 10,000, approaching tens of thousands of people how to code through Front-End Masters, which is frontendmasters.com. I guess I have to disclose that if you do watch my videos, I do get royalties. So that's not why I'm showing you this, but it's also, I feel like it's disingenuous to say otherwise. But it's a cool website where you can learn how to code, and I taught the intro to coding, and now people have watched over 10 years of this face of just human hours. So it's pretty cool. And that's this handsome gentleman down there, strapping young lad. Actually, just kidding, that was like 2 years ago, so it wasn't that long ago. So let's get some kind of basis around of like how to teach people how to code. So fundamental to good teaching is having common definitions of term. And this is actually pretty good marital advice as well. Best marital advice I ever got was when arguing, make sure you're arguing about the same thing, right? And that applies to just about every facet of life. How often do one of you set up like a straw man and you're attacking this thing and they're attacking this thing and you're just arguing about positively nothing because you're not actually arguing about the same thing? So a very, very good thing to do is if you're using terminology, especially terms that get overloaded, like reactive, right? Like reactive means so many things depending on what you're talking about. And even when you're talking about the same thing, it means different things. So in my particular case, I'm talking about knowledge. And when I use the term knowledge, that's a pretty overloaded term. It depends on who you ask about what knowledge is. Some people wrap wisdom and those sorts of things up into knowledge. Some people choose to separate those things out. But for me, literally took this off the dictionary, but this is what I'm referring to. It's facts, skills, techniques, and experience, and in this talk specifically as related to programming. So you can disagree with this definition, that's okay. I'm not totally sold on it, it's just that when I say knowledge today, right now, this is what I mean, okay? Another key to teaching is to establish and validate assumptions, because I'm going to make some assumptions about you, but if they're not valid assumptions, then everything, the house of cards falls apart. Also doubles as good marital advice, right? So I'm going to make the assumption here that you have a student that's a willing learner. You know enough to teach, which are, two large assumptions, but the last one's probably the most important one, that you care more about the student learning than you do about feeling smart. And when you say that aloud, it sounds very silly, right? It's like, of course I do. But if you're doing some like intense introspection about what you think and what you're actually trying to do, sometimes we go there, right? Like sometimes we go and we throw out big terms and jargons and all sorts of just stupid, meaningless bullshit just to make ourselves feel better and feel smarter. Like we have fragile egos. And like I'm describing myself right now, and I'm just applying that to you, and that's a good idea. But this is very, very important that that you get there, that you value the more than your ego, you value the learning process, or else this isn't going to work super well. Okay. So I'm going to go over kind of like my theory of knowledge, and this is where things can fall apart because, again, I'm not a scientist. I just like to think about things a lot. So I don't think I invented any of this. This actually arises from several conversations I've had, from things I've read on the internet, from arguments on Reddit, and I wish that was kidding, but it's probably actually partially true. So this is all programming knowledge. This is actually what it looks like to scale. Just kidding. So you can imagine the entire sum of computer science knowledge, programming, product engineering, design, user experience, user interfaces, can be represented as this upside down triangle, okay? And here's what you know. And I guess that's probably being pretty generous because all knowledge is huge, and to say that this is what you know is presumptuous, but we'll say this is not to scale, okay? So it represents the corner of programming knowledge that you do know, and this is only an infinitesimal piece of all programming knowledge available, okay? Here are the things that are what you don't know, right? And I realize this sounds a bit silly, but it kind of makes some sense if you sit there and think about it for a second. These are the sort of things that are within your grasp, right? That if you needed to learn them, you could learn them, right? So I'm going to give an example. Since many of you I think are .NET developers, if I asked you, it's like, hey, I need you to go build a Ruby on Rails project, and I need you to go do this other thing, right? You don't have it right now. You don't have that knowledge to be right now. I can just like crank that out right now on my laptop. But given sufficient time and sufficient resources, you'd be able to crank it out because it's like it's within your grasp, right? It's same sorts of knowledge. You have that. You could Google it. You could say like, okay, how do I do a for loop in Ruby, right? So those are the kind of things I'm talking about. So you know the thing exists. You had the vocabulary to be able to Google it. And surprisingly, most things come down, can you Google it? That's actually a pretty good litmus test of how well you are able to reach out and learn these things, is your ability to Google it. And honestly, half of programming is just knowing how to Google it. And actually, that's probably a lie. It's probably like 90% of programming is just knowing how to Stack Overflow that shit. Okay, so it's within reach. It's just not yet grasped. So my example here is for a beginning programmer, if they have just learned while loops and they know do loops exist, that is something they know that they don't know, but they could learn very quickly, right? Because a do loop is just kind of a specialized while loop. So given time and Googling, you can understand that. Okay, and here, this is my favorite one. What you don't know, okay? So these are things that are just totally outside of your grasp, right? Like you have no vocabulary to Google it, and you have no ability to describe these sort of problems. And right? A person that's just learning about if statements doesn't have the vocabulary to describe a free monad, right? Like it's mutually exclusive things. There's just no connection there. There's no path forward there. So it's what you don't even know it exists, right? It's not knowledge totally out of your reach. You can't Google it because you don't have the terminology to describe what you'd be looking for. So I think this is kind of an interesting thing to look at right here. I think this contributes to why less experienced devs overestimate their knowledge and why more experienced devs tend to underestimate their knowledge. Because if we go back here, and we're just looking purely at surface area because I like to overextend my analogies. If you have a smaller triangle of what you know you don't know, or sorry, what you know, that surface area looks much smaller to you. You see fewer things that you don't know, so you assume that you know a lot of things, right? Because what you can see that you don't know is a very small area. But the more and more you grow in knowledge and you grow in abilities, what you know expands and becomes larger and more grandiose. You can see all these things that you don't know. You become acutely aware of how stupid you actually are. And that actually ends up happening to me quite a bit. One, probably because I actually am stupid. And two, I'm acutely aware of it. So take that for what you will. So, okay, so this is Brian's upside down triangle of knowledge, which trademark, so don't use that. Just kidding. So why is this related to teaching? This is my knowledge, or my theory of knowledge. Well, let's kind of examine to like this, blow up this what you know part, okay? So here, as developers, this is like, okay, if you're in my wheelhouse, like if I know this stuff, I can teach it. Especially things that are like down here towards the bottom of the triangle, right? Because like this is the basics, right? It's like I got the basics down pat. If I have to write a for loop right now, I can literally blindfold myself and write it backwards, right? Because you've done it so many times and you know it really well. And here is the absolutely hilarious thing that has literally taken me years to figure out. I probably got taught 15, 20 workshops before I figured this shit out, is this is actually all I can really teach very well. Like right now, at this moment in time, this is the only thing I'm able to really teach well because this is the only thing I remember learning, right? And unfortunately, we're only really able to teach well the things that we remember learning innately, right? And that's a fascinating discovery for me on my part, is that I actually have this gap underneath me of things that I understand, but I can't teach very well. And so let's dive in and let's explore why that ends up being that way. Shared experience makes empathy harder. And this is so counterintuitive to me and something I really discovered, again, only recently. So let me give you an example of concretely of why that is, okay? You have Micah and you have Felipe, right? And look at these two happy gentlemen. Spoiler alert, Felipe is kind of an asshole. Okay, and so Micah and Felipe are going to go do a thing called a polar plunge. Does anyone know what a polar plunge is? Okay, so you're in for surprise. It's a stupid thing that maybe only Americans do, that you go jump in really, really cold water for no apparent reason. I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet, but that's what it is. So yeah, a polar plunge is when you dive into freezing water for some amount of time, and I guess that makes you more alive. I don't know. It just seems like a bad idea all the way around to me, but that's what it is, okay? So in this particular example, Micah was really, really super excited to go do the polar plunge. He worked up to it, and he had his hopes set on it. But at the last moment, he ends up chickening out and being afraid of it. Now, Felipe's done this a long time ago, and he's done it a couple of times. And he's not very sympathetic. Now, why is that? Well, one, Felipe's an asshole, so thanks, Felipe. But this is actually I'm basing this analogy exactly on the study that was done about this, is they had this exact story. Someone went to go do a polar plunge, chickens out. Someone that had never done it before. Here's the story about Micah really wanted to do this. He was really excited about it, and he doesn't do it. People say, like, that sucks. I feel for that because I've done that before, right, where I wanted to do something, and I didn't do it, and they identify with that story, and they feel sympathy / empathy. I'm mixing up my terms. I meant to say empathy all of those times. Okay, so they feel empathy, right? And when I say empathy, again, to define my terms, I mean that they put themselves in Micah's position. They attempt to understand what Micah is going through, despite the fact that they are not presently going through it. Okay? So people that have not done a polar plunge have empathy towards Micah. They then ask people that have previously done polar plunges, and those people say, I have less empathy for Micah because I've done that before. I've been there. I know what that's like, and I did it, so he must be able to do it too. And so it's funny. You would think the people that actually innately understood the thing that he had gone through, because they were probably pretty close to chickening out, and they almost, and they actually do know what the pain is, they feel less empathy, and it's because of this problem with shared experience. So this is called the empathy gap, which is, I didn't know there was a term for this idea that occurred to me, but that's actually what it is, and defined by a couple of papers that came out of Stanford. So as humans, we're really bad at recalling how painful experiences were, and that's really interesting, but the more you think about it, I think it kind of rings true. They repeated this particular study, but with people that went through divorce. And they asked people that had previously been divorced, what was it like? I forgot, anyway. So they asked some people going through a divorce, saying, you have Janet, right? And Janet's going through a particularly bad divorce. No fault divorce, she's just having a really hard time, and now she's depressed after her divorce. You have people that have never gone through divorce that say, wow, that really sucks for Janet. Like, I really feel for her, and I want her to do better. And then you have people that have gone through painful divorces, like, suck it up, Janet. Like, I can do it, you can do it, right? And that's, again, fascinating how sharing that experience with her actually made us less empathetic. So we choose to instead remember that we overcame challenges and we expect others to do so as well. And the paper went as far to postulate that one of the reasons for this is childbirth, and that women that go through this is total empathy. I have no idea. I don't even have a kid, so. But women are apt to forget what childbirth is like, so that they will do it again, right? That's evolutionary biology. Because otherwise, they would remember the pain. It's like, nah, fuck that noise. I'm gonna have one kid, right? I don't know if that's true or not, but it's an interesting idea. So let's take this and apply it to programming. your friend come over and says, hey, I'm having trouble with for loops. And we are, as asshole programmers on our ivory towers, inclined to say, oh, that's easy. Let me show you that shit. It's super easy. And we tend to downplay, and we tend to make people feel bad that they're going through these trials. And let me go ahead and invite you. This is super hard for me. I still do it all the time. Avoid when you're teaching people saying, that's easy, or that's simple, or that was easy for me, or whatever. All that stuff is just, all it does is just put down the person that's having trouble with it. So as much as possible, try and remove that from your vocabulary. That's actually them to be the judge if it's easy or not. And all you're doing is hurting them. So again, we're going back to that you're not trying to stroke your ego, you're trying to help them out. If you need something to replace that with, is we can do that with only a few steps, or maybe even get rid of only, right? Just say that this takes a few steps to do. Now, if your friend goes to his brother and says, hey, I'm having trouble with this concept in programming, the brother's probably going to be more apt to say, oh, that's really hard, dude. Like, that's so impressive that you're even able to do that stuff. So the brother looking up at your friend says, wow, I'm impressed that you've climbed so high on the ladder. And you, as a giant asshole that knows programming, are looking down and say, why can't you just climb a couple more stairs? So what you can actually teach well, right? And this is kind of the empathy gap, kind of going back to my graphic here. So we can kind of remember the things that we recently learned, the recent pain that we've gone through, and we kind of are more able to teach those things, right? Like I've only recently learned a lot about functional reactive programming until I got at Netflix, right? Because we Rx all the things. But if you try and get me to teach about when I learned React, right? I learned React 3 years ago, and it's kind of hard for me to remember what it was like learning it. And now I've taught enough workshops and had enough people say, hey, you're stupid, stop teaching it that way. I was like, oh, okay, I guess you're right. So what I want to get at is bridging the empathy gap is a learned and practiced skill. And I think that's kind of, again, counterintuitive. It was counterintuitive to me, so I'm presenting it to you as it's newfound knowledge, right? Whether or not that's new to you, you have to let me know. But bridging the empathy gap is hard. It's you have to practice at it. You have to learn how to do it. And the person who actually taught me this was Kyle Simpson, Getify on Twitter, AKA the guy that trolls you about JavaScript. God bless him. Actually, he was in Warsaw last week, which is kind of interesting. So you have to practice. You have to practice learning to overcome your empathy gap, right? And that involves, in order to be able to overcome your empathy gap, you have to acknowledge that you have one, right? You have to acknowledge and say, I learned this, and I forgot how I learned it. I forgot what that's like, and I don't know how to recover that. And that's kind of hard. At least it is for me. That you have to acknowledge that you don't remember what it's like to learn a skill. And then lastly, learning to peel back the layers of what you already know to teach someone using vocabulary that they know is hard. Because, for example, when you're teaching like for each, right, like a looping mechanism for functional programming, if they don't have like a sound basis of for loops, you have to pull back multiple layers of knowledge to get back to, like, okay, we have an instruction in a computer that gets run multiple times based on this construct, right? But then they're going to say, well, what's a construct, right? And so you have to pull back that knowledge, right? And you have to come back multiple steps until you're on their level. It's extremely hard. Hence why I put it in red. That's for emphasis. So let's talk about actually teaching someone empathetically. How many of you have had, well, let me rephrase that. How many of you do functional programming right now? 4, 5? No, just kidding. Cool, well, maybe you'll learn something about functional programming while I'm trying to be empathetic teaching functional programming. So I've been to a functional workshop before, and the teacher of this particular class just said it's a transformation that you apply to an array. And that is just such a bullshit way to teach that. Like I'm sure he was doing his best to teach me knowledge, and I'm just shitting on him, so I'm sorry. But that's just such a terrible way to teach it, because it feels more like patting your own ego rather than trying to actually teach them what you're trying to teach them. Right, so you just take a function that transforms one value to another, pass it into a map, and it transforms the array and gives you back a transformed array. It's a terrible explanation. It's awful. And it's one I've used before. The reason why I was able to write this so easily is because I've literally probably said those words before. And I'm imagining maybe one or two of you in the audience are looking at this like, yeah, I'd probably explain map that way. Yep, me too. Okay, so this is bad. Let's talk about why this is bad. Map really, at its basic center, is like what map really does is not actually super complicated. So we can kind of step back and say, assuming this person already knows what for loops is, it's like, okay, take an array, using the double function, create a new array that has every item in it doubled in it from the input array using the double function, right? So basically, I want you to write a for loop that runs double, creates a new array, and inserts a doubled value into every place in the array. Most people, most junior developers look at that as like, check, I can do that, right? They might ask you, like, why am I using double and not just saying x times 2? But just say, okay, cool, hold on, promise, just use double. Okay, so they come back and they'll probably say, oh, and then you might show them, this is what I want you to do. So 1, 4, 2, 6 becomes 2, 8, 4, 12, right? Arbitrary values become another set of doubled values of the same arbitrary values. So once the junior developer or whoever you're teaching understands that, then they can say, okay, filling in this array, double everything in an array. You're gonna create a new array, you're gonna loop over that input array, and just everything in the new array is gonna be doubled what it was in the input array. Cool? Cool, right? And now they've basically done a map, right? They've kind of hard-coded it so it only does double, but they've done a map basically as is, that they transformed an old array to a new array. And so at that point when they say like, hey, you're basically doing map, you're transforming old values to new values. So let's actually write this and see what it looks like when you're actually really doing map, okay? So take their same code that they just wrote and say, okay, you're gonna accept one more parameter, which is just gonna be an arbitrary function, right? And instead of calling double, you're gonna call func, right? And if you look down there at the very last line, line number 14, you're gonna map array and double, right? But what's really cool about that now is I can switch double out, right? It can be square. It can be, I don't know, any other imaginary function that you want it to be, it can be that. And so at that point, you use their own terminology on their level to describe what you want them to learn. And I think that's more of an empathetic way to look there and say, okay, let's bring this down onto your terms so you can understand what you want to be learning. And that's what I get really frustrated about. We're taking shit that's actually not very hard and we're making it really hard. I wrote map in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code, and it takes me like 40 words to describe it. I hope some of you see that and say, that's bullshit. You shouldn't have to make it so hard. Like, we don't have to use the jargony terms to pad our egos, to make ourselves feel better about what we're teaching. So we're taking poo emoji and making it hard. Let's talk about privilege for a second. And I'm not going to be talking about white privilege or gender privilege. It's something I definitely acknowledge that as a white guy from San Francisco, I'm pretty much at the top of the pyramid for privilege. But that's a conversation I should listen more to than I should explain. But what I am going to talk about, which I actually think I have some qualifications to talk about, is what I'm going to go ahead and call information privilege. So here's what you know, here's what your student knows, and that gap between what your student knows and what you know is what I don't know if I made this up, but it's information privilege, right? It's the gap between what you understand and what your student understands. So the point where you're sitting, you have an additional view that you have more context, and you can see how the pieces fit together, right? Imagine standing on a watchtower, right? And then you're explaining down to the person on the ground how someone is coming in. But if they can't see the paths, then it's not useful for you to describe their path to you using paths, right? So because you have an additional context, your terminology is not useful to the person on the ground. And that's information privilege because you have more available to you than the other person does. So unlike gender, racial ability, or other inherited trait privilege, your information privilege fluctuates constantly based on what you're talking about, right? And let me give you an example of that. I lived in Italy for a couple of years, and so I'm able to speak Italian fairly well. I found that out last week because I spent all last week in Italy, and it was wonderful. I love Italian people. They're both terrible and awesome and incredible and awful. So it's all those things all at once. Italy's like one of my favorite places. And so as soon as we start talking about Italian, I climb up the pyramid a lot higher. But then I got here, and I don't even know. That's probably like I'm an idiot in Polish, right? I literally just put it into Google Translate, so I'm hoping that says, I don't speak Polish. Anyone? Okay, cool. I'm not offending anyone yet, so. But in 2 slides, parlo italiano, and I'm not even going to try and say it, but that, I went from the top of the pyramid, well, at least probably in this classroom, unless there's any Italians in here, to close to the bottom, of the absolute bottom. The only thing I know how to say in Polish is, I'm going to say it wrong, but whatever, I'm on stage, no zdroje, right? Thank you to Rafa and Mihail. So I got my priority straight. I figured that one out first. So yeah, in 2 slides, I went from privilege to the bottom of the information pyramid. So this is another gap for you to overcome when you're teaching someone, is you have to recognize your privilege, right? You have to recognize where you are in this particular step. And in this particular case, this privilege you earned, right? You worked hard enough. Like I lived in Italy for 2.5 years, and God damn it, the first 4 months were some of the hardest of my life because I just wanted to go home, right? I just want to go back to America and have a goddamn cheeseburger. But I was stuck there with pasta and Italians. But so I had to fight through that, and like after that, it was wonderful. Like I love spending time in Italy now, and that's a privilege that I earned, right? I put my time in, I learned how to speak Italian, right? And so, privilege is not a dirty word. It's okay to be in a privileged position, right? You just have to recognize where you are, and you have to adjust accordingly. So let's talk about functional programming then, and let's talk about how we can be a little bit more empathetic with it. I use functional programming because that's the one I feel a little bit more privileged to talk about. Oh, you just need to use pure functions, right? Like, who here has heard an asshole say that? I have. I don't know. Maybe you work with really nice people here. Okay, well, no. Well, how about you need to use a function without side effects, right? Well, that's not much better. We're still using kind of jargony buzzwords. Well, okay, you need a function that doesn't keep or modify any state. But if they're not used to working with stateful functions, then not super useful either. So well, maybe we can do better. Okay. Oh, you need a function that given inputs gives output, which that's so reductive, it's almost insulting, right? So that's not super useful either. Well, how about, oh, you just need to use Haskell. And I just say, fuck all that noise, right? Like that, none of that's useful. Had to throw a Haskell joke in there somewhere. Or F#. I guess it would be more appropriate for this crowd, right? So when I start talking more about functional programming, I start alluding more to this. I was like, you have, lines 1 through 3. That is like you show them, okay, we have a double function. It takes in a number and it returns that number times 2, right? And I can call this function 10 billion times. And on the 10 billion and first time, what's my answer? It's the same, right? It never changes, right? There's nothing going around that you have to worry about that I can call it 11 billion times, right? And I can ask you, okay, write a unit test for this. And they're like, okay, well, return, 3 times 2 is 6, right? But then I show them bad double. And I say, okay, I'm going to call this 11 billion and 5 times. On 11 billion and 6 times, what do I get? Now, I know there's got to be some asshole in the audience that's sitting there like working it out. It's like, I can tell you. But my point is like it's not intuitively obvious, right? You have to go into full asshole mode to be able to solve it. So this is not functional, right? We call this side effects, right? Because you have I'll have bad counter and counter. So this is actually even an error, which is even worse. Good job, Brian. But this is a illustrative way to show people like this is how you learn functional programming. So using jargon actively puts distance between you and your student and understanding the concept. So going back to one of our fundamental assumptions, you want them to learn more than you want them to feel smart. So just cut the jargon out, demonstrate to them what the jargon is, and then point out that's the jargon so they can go be an asshole to someone else. Okay? So these are kind of my thoughts on teaching functional programming, teaching reactive programming to people and how to be empathetic while teaching. And I think it's really important. It's something that I constantly strive to work on harder and probably constantly fail at. You can probably ask people in my workshop yesterday that I'm still working that shit out. Okay, so I promised a little bit of a primer. I think I got it about 10 minutes on observables and where they are in JavaScript, why they're great, and why you shouldn't use promises. Just kidding. You should use promises sometimes, but not all the time. Okay? So ES7 observables. And most of you, or some of you might know, well, I guess I need to define my terminology. ES7, right? We just launched ES6 for JavaScript, which is the latest revision of JavaScript, which is a big deal because JavaScript moves at a snail's pace, right? So ES7 is the next version of that. Unfortunately, they renamed that, so it's not actually ES7 anymore, it's ES 2016. So now it's actually going to be named after the year, so that's the revision of JavaScript it is. Unfortunately, if you don't know, ES 2016 was exactly 2 features. So we only got 2 features last year, or this year rather. We got array.includes, which I don't think anyone's super excited about. I mean, it should have already been there before. Someone might have already assumed it was there, and now it is. And the other one is exponents, or at least a better way to write exponents. So, yay, you can now write x asterisk asterisk 2 instead of saying math.pow x comma 2. So take your pick. So we didn't actually make it into ES 2016, so shit. Okay, so ES 2017. And actually we didn't make ES 2017 either, or we're probably not going to. So I actually work with the author, Jafar Hussain. We ride the same shuttle to Netflix every day. And so I get to sit next to him. He's the author of the proposal. And it's kind of moving at a snail's pace right now. They're trying to get it in for 2017, 2018, probably looking more towards 2018. So if you're curious, that's where we're kind of standing with that. So, and I kind of was shitty about talking about observables, so I just crossed that out for fun too. So JavaScript lol. It's fun. I like the language a lot, but it can be frustrating. So let's talk about Rx, because I never want to assume that people know Rx because it's a complicated beast. So like I permit you to feel like it's hard because it is indeed hard. And if anyone tells you that it's not hard, then they're either full of shit or they're really smart and they're probably just full of shit. So let's assume that. So arrays. The best way to learn about reactive programming is just really to understand functional programming. And the best way to understand functional programming is really to understand arrays a little bit better, for the most part. So a group of values, right? So line 2, I got a group of numbers, and line 3, I got a group of the MLS teams, which is the best soccer league in the world. I don't know if anyone knew that, but it is. Go Real Salt Lake. I don't think anyone cares. I'm not a Real Madrid fan. Fuck you if you say I am, I'm not. But go Real. Okay. So using map, we can transform entire arrays, right? So if you go from line 2 transforms to line 2 if we use like a double function, and line 3 transforms to line 3 if we use like a 2 uppercase function. So let's take a look at what those actually look like. So numbers.map, double, right? So we apply that and we double it over time. We kind of talked about map a little bit already. And then we have a make uppercase one, which just to show you that we're not limited to numbers, we're not limited to strings. We can even transform from one type to another type, and that's totally cool. So in the second one we're just returning a 2 uppercase version, okay? So far so good, if we're feeling good about map. Okay, so what happens if we took an array and we have an array, but instead of everything being available all at once, right? So if we go back here, we can see all these numbers are immediately available for consumption and reading, right? What happens if we took that array and just made it available over time, right? So everything wasn't available right away. So instead of, getting 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 all at once, we got 0, pause for 10 seconds, 1, right? Pause for 10 more seconds, right? So it's kind of like an open-ended array. So we've now taken an array and we stretched it out over time. You can think about doing set timeout. You can think about a server being slow and giving you back values. Up to you. Whatever mental model fits you best. But what's really cool about this, since we're not using a for loop or anything like that, we're just using a function, right? We can apply these functions as the values come in, right? Because it's only operating on one function or one item at a time, right? So, you know, like 0, 1, 2, 3, like it's doing that sequentially. Well, we can just put spaces between when those things are happening. So we're doing transformations over time. So because it's a function, we can apply this function now or we can apply it later. Okay? So you can think of an observable as a useful mental model is an array that appears over time. Now, in fact, this is kind of the way that you can think about it, right? So you have 0, some time, 1, and then immediately 2 comes, and you get some more time, right? That kind of idea. So those periods just serve to show you that, kind of adapt you to that mental model that's appearing over time. The classic example is always the stock ticker. If you've ever done any sort of Rx, the stock ticker always comes up because it's just the one that makes sense, right? You have stock values that appear over time, right? So you can have an observable of stock prices that just get pushed at you. So that's another useful idea. So let's say I wanted to do the exact same thing, but I wanted to do it over an observable, right? So I put space between all these different values, and then whenever they arrive, I would apply a transformation, then give them back to you. Well, here's my favorite part about observables. That's the same code, right? I did not change anything. So really the only thing that's changed between my last example and this example is numbers was an array, and in this particular example, numbers is an observable. So once you understand functional programming, you're most of the way there to understanding functional reactive programming. The only thing that you're doing now is you're introducing time into the mix. So we get to treat arrays and observables the same way. This is also known as vector programming. Now this is only part of functional programming. Functional programming is a wild, crazy, huge piece of computer science that is fascinating and amazing, will make you a better programmer. And I only understand this much of it. But it'll make you a better programmer. And this is just a small part of it. Same thing with functional reactive programming. There's more to it than this. But let's be honest, most of observable programming is just taking observables, applying a transformation, and getting out other values. So to answer my original question, why not promises? Well, promises are great for AJAX requests or things that have one value and then return. They suck for orchestration, they suck for chaining, they suck for multi-events, they suck for cancellation, and basically anything but AJAX requests or anything that is just a one-off thing. So, and they also suck to debug. Observables also still suck to debug, so I just wanted to throw that out there, make sure that everyone's not expecting anything different. But they're complex, so they're hard. Observables end up being really hard, especially once you start composing them together. But they are composable, which promises are not. They're declarative, they're super easy to cancel, and they're able to model just about any system any complex system very well. So Observables ES.next, it's coming. It'll land. Maybe ES 2018, so if I was going to guess. But TC39 wants cancelable promises, observables, async await generators, and async iterators all to play nice together. So that's the general status of things. So that's the cutest dog in the world, also known as my dog. Her name's Luna. My name is Brian. I'm here if you want to ask any questions. I hit all of my time, so thank you.